do that. But welcome everybody to the SORA Winter Webinar. We've got our end of year survey that I am just grabbing the link for really quick to put into the chat. Here we are. Alrighty. Start sharing this again really quick. Great. Cool. All right. So, as I said, welcome everybody to the SORA Winter Webinar. I think there's our other presenter, but I need to promote you. Make a presenter. There we go. Cool. A couple quick housekeeping things that I'd like to share before we get started. SORA's executive committee is looking for new members, so if you haven't been to one of these before, you don't know me. My name is Michael Mativa. I am the chair for SORA. So I lead the executive committee. That's who plans all these types of events, finds speakers, looks into doing other kind of workforce development things, other projects that SORA tries to put on. It's a pretty low time commitment. It's just monthly 1-hour meetings where we plan these types of things, discuss development opportunities, like I said. So if you're interested, now would be a good time to join. We're having kind of our reset for the year and our elections and stuff in January. So you'd be more than welcome to join. Just shoot me an email, michael.mativa@dor.oregon.gov, whenever you, if you feel that's something you might be interested in. And then a last quick thing is that our end of year survey is now live. I'm going to drop the link in chat right now. So there's that. Hopefully everyone can see that. That helps us out if you just take that, lets us know how people are interacting with SORA, what you guys want to see, what matters to you for these types of professional development webinars, and gauge interest for other sorts of activities. So it should only take probably a minute, maybe 2 minutes tops to run through that. So if you could just take that quickly, that would help us out in a big way. That link is in the chat. So without further ado, I think we've got most people, I think, in by now, 3 minutes after the hour. I see a question right off the bat in the chat. Can you summarize what SORA does? Yeah, so SORA is a pretty informal organization, I'd say, of all the research and data people from across Oregon. Mostly what we do is put on these sort of quarterly webinars. We talk about all kinds of things, from specific tools like Power BI all the way to kind of broader topics like this equity and inclusion webinar, but all having to do kind of in the data and research sphere. In the past, we've had in-person events, more like networking opportunities and stuff. That went away with COVID, and we've not kind of seen enough interest in that to really get it going back up. But if that's something you're interested in, please indicate so in the survey. Yeah, and we'd be happy to put something like that on if there's interest. Another quick note is that somehow I've tried to get a Q&A going every time for these webinars, never been able to. This time it looks like there's a Q&A. So if you have an actual question, please use the Q&A feature. Before I was just monitoring chat, and that is not as easy. So yeah, click on over to the Q&A tab, put your question in there, and we'll make sure that that gets asked at the end of our session here. So now, without further ado, I can stop sharing here, and I can introduce our two panelists, I guess, presenters. We have Adam McBride-Smith and Christine Getman, both from OHA. Adam is a digital accessibility and UX consultant with OHA, and then Christine is OHA's Accessibility, Inclusion, and Education Unit Manager. So thank you guys both for being here. Appreciate you taking the time to come speak with SORA, and yeah, take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to share the slides first in the chat.
Oh, one additional note. This webinar is being recorded. It will go up on our YouTube channel and on our website, oregonresearch.org. So if you have to drop out for any reason, anybody watching in the audience, that will come up later. Q&A button's giving an error message, of course.
Yeah.
Well, you can also drop questions in chat, and I will grab them from there. So
I am unable to add my slides in the chat.
Those will be, we can upload those to our website as well, so people can grab those from there.
I'll tell you what, Michael, I'll email them to you right now, and if you want to add them,
perfect.
If anyone needs them while we're going through.
I could certainly try, yeah.
You may have more luck than I'm having.
Sounds good.
1 second. Apologies. There we go. Okay. That's sent, and we always like to, just as a matter of accessibility, share our slides at the top if we can, so that folks can check them out in whatever way makes the most sense to them and have access to the links and so forth. But I'll also go ahead and share my screen. So let me get this open. And oh, actually, let me do one thing. Apologies. Here we go. And I am going to get this started. Okay. Can everyone see that slide okay? Seeing hearts, seeing thumbs up. Great. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Please let us know if you are having trouble with seeing any of the slides or any other materials or hearing us. Let's get started. So happy to be here today. We're going to take just a minute and introduce ourselves. So my name is Adam McBride-Smith. I use he, him pronouns. I am actually no longer a consultant. I was for several years a consultant with the state. And in fact, I think this webinar was scheduled so long ago that I was still a consultant at the time it was scheduled, but I am now actually digital accessibility strategist full-time for the state on the Accessibility, Inclusion, and Education team, Equity Inclusion Division at OHA. And I'm here presenting today with my unit manager, colleague, and friend, Christine Getman, and I'll let Christine introduce herself.
Thanks, Adam. And also mic check, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I'm Christine Getman. Cool, thanks for the thumbs. I'm Christine Getman. I use she, her pronouns as mentioned. I'm the Accessibility, Inclusion, and Education Unit Manager in the Equity and Inclusion Division of OHA. We have a wonderful team of folks who support disability access, digital access, language access, workforce equity, and equity training, and also organizational resilience and healing. So very honored to have such an incredible team. Today, I want to give a brief visual. I have long dark hair styled down, wearing red lipstick, a white sweater with black stripes, and behind me is my home office. You will occasionally see some four-legged coworkers behind me on the couch. And I think we are ready to get started. Adam, do you want to give your visual and take us through our agenda for the day?
Yeah, absolutely. Apologies. I'll give a brief visual description as well. I am a middle-aged white guy. I've got short hair and a short salt and pepper beard and a dark gray sweater because I spilled coffee all over my light gray sweater about half an hour ago. But fortunately, I have plenty of sweaters. So, what we're going to talk about today, we are going to briefly touch on what digital accessibility is and who needs it. We'll talk about some models and values that we use in our work. We are going to touch on the new federal rules and the guidelines that undergird those federal rules. We're going to talk about our approach to the rules through policies at OHA and ODHS. We'll talk about what we're doing and where we're going with policy implementation. And then I know that some of you or many of you have an interest in accessibility and data visualizations. We wanted to touch on that a bit today as well. We won't be able to go into all of the detail, but we're going to try to direct you towards resources and talk about what we think are some important things to keep in mind with accessibility and data visualizations. And with that, I will hand things back to Christine.
Thanks, Adam. So to guide our work, it's good to be centered on our values and why we're doing this. So in our team, we have a working definition that helps us answer the question, what is digital accessibility? And if you have your own definition or if you have additions to this definition, we would love for you to include that in the chat. Tell us where you are in your journey in digital accessibility. So for us, we say that digital accessibility is an approach to technology and content design that involves thinking specifically about the experiences and the needs of people with disabilities. By designing for these needs and by following the guidance and the leadership of people with disabilities, we arrive at technology that works better for everyone. So if anyone is familiar with the models of disability, we'll touch on those a little more. Disability justice, leadership of those most impacted is really at the core of what guides this work. Next slide, please. So who needs accessible content? Who benefits from digital accessibility? And who can uphold digital accessibility? I'd like you to sit with those questions as we explore this hour together. At the core definition, and you'll see this in both of the policies that we share today, accessible content supports people who are blind or deafblind, people who are low vision, people with color blindness, people who have motor disabilities. And full disclosure, I have a motor disability, and I can share a little bit more about how that affects me when we get into the WCAG standards. Accessible content can also support access for people with cognitive or learning disabilities, folks who are deaf or hard of hearing, people who are speakers of English as a second language or have additional languages, and also folks who might be experiencing a temporary or situational disability that could be due to illness or injury or other factors that could cause someone to need additional access based on the situation. Does everyone feel pretty comfortable with that? Let's go to the next slide. So with access needs in mind, it's also important to note the types of assistive technology that people use to interface and access digital content. And you'll hear us refer to several of these more than others, but all of the practices, all of the techniques that we will be sharing later will support all of these types of AT, assistive tech, to access content and particularly data visualization elements. So you'll hear us talk a lot about screen readers. Common software would be JAWS, NVDA, VoiceOver, and Narrator. So that reads out loud to a user what is on the screen, if it is set up correctly, which is part of why we're here to help. Text-to-speech software also, speech-to-text, so that goes the other direction, the user speaking into their device to support in getting ideas onto the page and navigating through the screens verbally. There's also magnification software. It's really important. There's dark mode, and all of us actually have access, I think, to dark mode with our current software, and other customizable color palettes. There's keyboard access, switch devices, which is like a button that helps click through and switch through different screens and pages and button commands. and then on-screen keyboards. And with those, there's also a function called dwell, and that can provide auto-clicking that is built in through the on-screen keyboards. And that means somebody can hover over and click on a letter that serves as a physical keyboard, but it's actually on their screen. And that's what I use. Next slide, please. So to help guide us and ground us in the work and why we approach it in this way, it's important to learn a little bit and get comfortable with the models of disability. And these are studies of how disability interacts with medical fields, social culture, educational and government institutions, and the workforce. And it's a really interesting way. I've had so much fun just journeying down these. I'm a bit of a nerd, admittedly, but understanding the sets of beliefs that help us explain social attitudes and actions towards disability. Next slide. So these are common models and a quick kind of cheat sheet on how these models view somebody with a disability. And I know it kind of sounds strange to be labeling people in this way, but it will make sense as we approach the way that we address digital access. So in the medical model, that often says that the individual who is disabled is the one that needs fixing. You'll hear a lot of this around cure culture and providing cures and treatment to prevent that disability. And we often spend a lot of time talking about, especially in OHA and other health agencies who are here today, how do we uphold disability in a world where our work is also trying to prevent disease and disability, right? So that's something that it takes time to sit with and to feel comfortable talking about. The charity model says that the person who is disabled is the victim of their disability. They need support. We must help them. It's a tragedy. Right? I think you've heard this. We might see this in certain news and maybe commercials this time of year for year-end giving, if you have access to television. The economic model views disabled folks as not being as productive, right? We can't produce and create and earn and engage in capitalism. That's an element of the economic model. The moral model is really interesting, and there's some sentiment saying that that person somehow deserves their disability. They must have been doing something, right? We don't vibe with that. The social model, flipping this kind of on the more positive side, is that society and the barriers that we experience in society are the disabling factors. And the identity model, again, going a little higher, is that the person who is disabled is unique and celebrated. So you kind of feel the vibes there. Thumbs up if you've heard of this before. Heart if you know which ones you align with. Thank you. Next slide, please. Love it. Love to see it. So in our work, we often encounter the medical and the social models. On the screen here, there is a cartoon of a wheelchair user encountering a flight of stairs. They are at the base of the stairs, but there's a sign at the stairs that says, "Weigh in, everyone welcome." So the medical model would say that the disabled person is kind of the issue here, and we should treat them and cure them so they can go up the flight of stairs. But the social model says that the environment, this physical barrier, these stairs are the issue, and we should build a ramp. We should create access for this individual. And so in our work, we kind of have to balance these two models the most. I think today, though, you will hear us leaning into the social model of how can we make our content, our data visualization, our websites more accessible so everyone can reach that content equitably. Next slide, please. Am I passing to you? Yes. So what's guiding the work, Adam?
Yeah, thanks. And I should have said up front, and I'll say now, our goal with this presentation is for it to last about 45 minutes and to leave some time at the end for questions. We'll try not to go over. Of course, if you want to put questions, it sounds like maybe the Q&A function is not working, but either in Q&A or in the chat, wherever is the appropriate place, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can at the end. So let's go from there to just a general timeline of recent federal rules and guidelines, and then our agency policies. So going back to November of 2022, back when I was a contractor, before I became full-time, the Digital Accessibility Policy Work Group for OHA and ODHS started meeting to discuss ways to improve policy around digital accessibility for the agencies. In the midst of that process then, so July of last year, July 25th, 2023, the DOJ published its Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on Accessibility of Web Information and Services of State and Local Government Entities, quite a mouthful. That was actually the continuation of an effort that goes all the way back to 2010, when the advance notice of proposed rulemaking on this subject was released. As is often the case, there were many delays, some foreseen, some unforeseen, but ultimately we arrived at a place where the DOJ was able to take this rulemaking process to the next step with that notice. And at that time, notably, WCAG 2.1 was the recommended version of WCAG, and so that was what the DOJ's notice of proposed rulemaking aligned with. What happened shortly thereafter, so October 5th of that year, 2023, WCAG was updated, we can say, that is to say WCAG 2.2 became the recommended standard of WCAG. And then in April 24th of this year, 2024, the DOJ's final rule was published. And I'll just pause to note that when the DOJ published its final rule, it kept WCAG 2.1 as the standard for compliance, pardon me, even though the W3C had updated the WCAG standard to WCAG 2.2. This has happened before. It's not the end of the world. It just can cause confusion sometimes, but it did happen when Section 508 was refreshed in 2017, and then a few months later, the WCAG 2.1 standard was released. So we've dealt with this sort of confusion that can result from those from the updating of WCAG before. It's not a huge deal, but just to kind of clarify why that sort of happened the way that it did. And so then the final note on this slide, following the publication of that DOJ rule, the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, very quickly thereafter on May 9th released their rule on non-discrimination on the basis of disability under Section 504, which is quite a broad rule with many constituent parts, but the part of that rule on digital accessibility mirrors almost exactly the DOJ rule on digital accessibility. That matters to us at OHA because that we also fall under that HHS rule in addition to the DOJ rule. So a little bit more about those rules. So the new DOJ and HHS rules. The DOJ rule applies to all digital content produced by or for the state of Oregon. An important note there, this includes content that the state procures from vendors. And the HHS rule covers all entities that receive federal healthcare money. So again, that applies directly to us at OHA, as well as our vendors and partners, such as the CCOs, et cetera. A few more details about the new rules on this slide. So once again, the DOJ rule and the HHS rule set a technical standard of WCAG, that is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, 2.1 levels A and AA. They provide a 2-year timeline for states. So the compliance deadline for the DOJ rule for a state such as Oregon is April 24th, 2026. And they cover, a broad array of digital content, but we wanted to note here, because this is very important for states. Oregon is not alone in this, in that we have a lot of documents. So it is important to note that the rules explicitly cover conventional electronic documents, which are defined as these 4 types: PDFs, word processor files like Word docs, presentation files like PowerPoints, and spreadsheet files like Excel files. Let's talk a little bit more about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. Some of you may be familiar with these. Some of you may be very familiar with them. For some of you, this may be a new concept, so we just wanted to talk about them briefly. So WCAG, often it is often pronounced as WCAG, but you'll sometimes hear people say other things, WCAG or WCAG. All of those are totally fine. I say WCAG. WCAG was developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, and it's, I will say, now quite an old standard. The first version of this was developed in 1999, and it's still with us, so it has stood the test of time. It provides technology-neutral accessibility standards for digital content. Many countries around the world now reference WCAG as a technical standard for digital accessibility, and that includes, just off the top of my head, the UK, the EU, Japan, Canada, Australia, and the US under Section 508, and now explicitly under the ADA. There are 4 iterative versions of WCAG. So 1.0, as mentioned, first published in 1999, 2.0, which I think came along in 2008, 2.1, which came in 2017, and then 2.2, which was published last year. And there are 3 conformance levels of WCAG: A, AA, and AAA. For our purposes, I think the most important thing to remember is that A and AA are typically the legal conformance standards, and then AAA success criteria are considered best practice, although even the W3C says that they don't advise trying to meet all AAA success criteria because some of them can be quite difficult in certain circumstances. So they are considered best practice advisory criteria. Moving on from there, a little bit more detail about WCAG on this next slide. As mentioned, we talked about the dates when the different versions were published. The next point here just gives a little more information about WCAG 2.2 and a link to that standard. And by the way, you might want to follow those links. I know Michael put them in the chat as well. Sometimes if you go and Google Google search WCAG 2.1 or 2.2, you will get branded content from a consultancy rather than the W3C WCAG standard as your first or second choices. But make sure that when you do references that you go to the W3C pages, because that is where the standard lives. So WCAG 2.2, as mentioned, was elevated to recommended status on October 5th of 2023, making it the current standard. WCAG 2.2 has 56 success criteria, or SCs, at A and AA level. It's important to note that all versions of WCAG 2, so 2.0, 2.1, and 2.2 are additive and backward compatible. So in our agency policies, as mentioned on this slide, we ultimately aligned with WCAG 2.2, levels A and AA, but these are backward compatible standards. So by meeting WCAG 2.2, we also meet the DOJ standard of WCAG 2.1. And these other points on this slide make that point. That brings us to, okay, so our new OHA and ODHS shared policies on digital accessibility. We ended up with 2 policies. So our content creation and sharing policy, or ODHS OHA 010-029, and then hardware, software, and systems policy, ODHS OHA 010-030. And you can, we'll share those links in a minute so that you can click on them and follow them. As As we discussed, they were developed by the Digital Accessibility Policy Work Group over the course of 2 years. Work group participants from OHA included participants from OHA and ODHS, as well as representatives from DAS and Oregon Broadband, Oregon Commission for the Blind, etc. And I will hand things back to Christine.
Thanks, Adam. So yeah, let's explore these two policies. And this is an example of a way that you can respond to these new rules. And so as Adam shared, between ODHS and OHA, the choice was to respond with two policies. And so this first one is a digital accessibility in content creation and sharing. And I put a link in the chat to the original, to the policy right there. So this policy ensures that any form of digital content created by the agency and provided either internally or externally is accessible because the digital content adheres to WCAG 2.2 levels A and AA. This includes, but is not limited to, websites, reports, surveys, dashboards, and documents. It's also important to note, and if you click on that link and explore the policy, you'll see this language in there, but it says plain language content in formats that give individuals experiencing equity barriers the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services in an equally integrated and effective manner, and with equivalent ease as someone without the barrier. So very much that social model that we introduced at the top of the hour. Any questions on this one? All right, let's go to the next slide.
Hey, sorry, we do have a couple questions. We have, first, does accessibility include non-English language access? Oh, sorry, you're muted, I believe.
I was going to say not under this policy, under a different policy, though. And Christine, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so under, we have AFLAS and 1557, which both guide language access. So together, our powers combined, our policies combined, it does indeed ensure accessibility for non-English language access. And I don't have the links handy right now, but John, I can circle back with you after this.
And then our other question related to the OHA and ODHS shared policies on digital accessibility. Do those only apply to ODHS and OHA, or would it apply to all agencies? Could you just clarify that?
Sure. These policies are OHA and ODHS's response to the rules, and we're sharing them broadly in case other agencies would like to also create policies to support their agency and their agency's response to the rules, if that helps. So these two policies that we shared are specific to Oregon Health Authority and Oregon Department of Human Services, but we're sharing as an example of something that a way that you could approach the new federal rules. Does that make sense? So these don't tell you what you need to do, but you can absolutely follow along in parallel with us.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So the second policy that helps us get closer is the digital accessibility in hardware, software, and systems. So not only what we create, but what we use to create. And I'm going to paste the link right now. Adam, if you can go to the next slide. So this policy describes the requirements for procuring or building ITC solutions in alignment with WCAG 2.2, again, level A and AA guidelines. And ITC stands for Information and Communication Technology Solutions. And so that's the acronym ITC, which describes information, technology, content, applications, and services. So under that umbrella, we are referring to all hardware and all software. agency and third-party created multimedia and electronic content, as well as electronic hardware, software, and documents used by both ODHS and OHA. So those are the very, very cliff notes of the policies, but please feel free to explore those if you have the time. Next slide.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to pause before I move to the next slide, and just say an easy way to remember these policies and how we referred to them internally. The first one was we called the content policy, and the second one we called the procurement policy. We ultimately made the decision to break these into two policies because we had the advice that the procurement piece was going to be more complex and might need to be worked on separately. It is an important piece of this, though, because we do purchase so much of our content and our technology solutions from vendors. And, you know, I think that we're going to have to look at those processes, look at our contracts, which is what many other states have done as a part of trying to meet these rules in an effort to ensure that what we are purchasing meets the standards and that we're doing our due diligence there. So yeah, moving on. This question comes up sometimes, and so we wanted to touch on it briefly. The exceptions that were part of the rules that ended up in our policies. And we'll talk about two big ones here. So exception 1 is for archived web content. And archived web content under the rules means content that meets all of the following conditions. And there are 4 of these. So first, and probably most importantly, it was created before the date the public entity is required to comply, April 24th, 2026, and it reproduces paper document, or it reproduces paper documents created before the date the public entity is required to comply, or reproduces the contents of other physical media created before that date, etc. That's important to note because there's a carve out here, but that carve out ends on that date in 2026. Other criteria for being considered as falling under this exception. So secondly, the content was retained exclusively for reference, research, or record keeping. 3, it is not altered or updated after the date of archiving, although the DOJ notes that minor redactions for the purposes of confidentiality are allowed. And 4, it is organized and stored in a dedicated area or areas clearly defined as being archived. And this can include a section of a website or a page designated as an archive, or an entire site or database designated as an archive. The second exception falls along the same lines, but it's providing a bit more of a carve out for pre-existing conventional electronic documents. So what this exception says is that pre-existing conventional documents, electronic documents, means conventional electronic documents. That is one of the 4 types that we discussed that are available as part of the public entity's web content or mobile apps before April 24th, 2026. And so that's to say that these documents, again, like the archived content up until that date, don't necessarily have to be accessible. And also don't necessarily need to be put in an archived area like the content that we discussed in the previous exception, except there's a huge caveat here, and that's the last point on this slide. Unless such documents are currently used to apply for, gain access to, or participate in the public entity's services, programs, or activities. That's actually going to be a lot of documents, that we're creating in the next year and a half. Not all of them, but many of them will probably still be in use by the public to do one of these things after that date. So those do need to be accessible. They need to meet the standard. Now, a couple of other, I think, more minor exceptions that are sort of kind of, not hugely surprising, but The first of these, content posted by a third party where the third party is not posting due to contractual licensing or other arrangements with a public entity. What that means is if someone posts something on a social media account, on an agency social media account, we're not responsible for that person's or that entity's post being acceptable. This does not apply, however, to an app or a website or other content built by a vendor under contract. Those do fall under the rule. And then pre-existing social media posts, that is something posted before April 24th, 2026, we don't have to go back and fix those for accessibility, but following that date, they do have to be accessible, which means thinking about things like alt text, thinking about accessible multimedia, etc., and color contrast. And I'll note here one other point. There was quite a bit of pushback to the exceptions that were written into these rules by the disability community. The NFB, for example, National Federation for the Blind, which ultimately did, celebrate the publication of the rule. But when the proposed rule was published, pushed back pretty hard on the exceptions that had been included in the proposed rule and which were ultimately retained to a large extent in the published rule. Some states took the step of, when they published statewide statutes to guide implementation of the rules, they stripped out all of the exceptions, and Colorado did this, for example. We did in our rulemaking ultimately remove one exception, and that was the exception for password protected individualized documents. We felt that was the most egregious and needless of these exceptions, and so we removed it from our policy, which is to say that under our policies, individualized password protected documents still need to be accessible. And I'll note also that, of course, all of the standard ADA exceptions, such as fundamental alteration, do still apply, as this is the DOJ rule is a rule under the ADA. Let's see. So from there, let's talk about what we're doing to implement these policies. So we have launched an Oregon.gov page to communicate the requirements, our progress, and guidance on digital accessibility. And there's a link here. We'll put that in the chat. We have launched that now. That is available for you to peruse. And the goal here was to look at what other states with very robust digital accessibility programs, thinking of what has been done in Colorado, what's been done in Minnesota, in Texas, and elsewhere. A lot of these states have public-facing digital accessibility pages where they share exactly these things. So we're trying to do that, at least at the agency level. We have started a series of accessible toolkits. So we have an accessible document toolkit. We have an accessible data visualization toolkit, which I think will maybe be of interest to some of you or many of you, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. This guidance is intended to be iterative, so we will add to it over time. We may need to revise it over time, but this is where it's going to live going forward, and we want to be as transparent as possible. And also, part of our philosophy is trying to share as much of our work with the wider state. Of course, all of us ultimately need to meet the federal rules, if not our agency policies. Counties as well, cities as well, fall under the ADA Title II. So our philosophy is to share as much as we can, and try to do what we can to support those efforts wherever folks are working on these things. Beyond that, we have secured project management support on both the OHA and ODHS sides for this effort. At OHA, we are working on creating a charter and steering committee. I think our tentative launch date for that has now been moved out a bit to February 15th of 2025. Our unit, the AIE unit, is in the process of hiring to help with digital accessibility. And we have, of course, been doing some testing and remediating work all along, but we're going to begin in a more systematic way, surveying and remediating websites, apps, and documents in early 2025. And we're looking to do this on a division-by-division basis at OHA. And we're hoping to also offer rolling training for accessible content creation in 2025. And okay, yes. So that brings us to accessibility and data visualizations. And I know we're creeping up on the end of time, so I think we'll try to go through this relatively quickly and just point you to that website, which is in the chat now. And if you follow that website, go to the section with toolkits and guidance, and then look for the data visualization toolkit and data visualization quick guide. You'll find this checklist there. And there's a link also in the slide. Since we're running out of time, we don't have time to talk about all of these items, but I'll just say, going back to, I think 2021, I worked quite a bit with a number of other very talented folks working in Tableau and Power BI, as well as assistive tech testers to create guidance. Some of that guidance was ultimately published in the Tableau Accessibility Guide that was published in 2022. But we wanted to provide, kind of a one-stop shop for this guidance for Tableau. For now, for Tableau and Power BI, we are looking to expand that out to other resources that the state uses to create data visualizations, such as R. That's a project we're working on. Hopefully, we'll be able to offer that guidance in the coming year. But in any case, this is the checklist that we have, and there's more extensive guidance for each of these points as a part of that quick guide on the website. If we go to the next few slides, so we thought today we might give you just a few quick pointers that we think are some of the more impactful points on that checklist as they apply specifically to data visualizations. And we decided to look at 3 in particular. So this first one says, consider moving large blocks of text out of dashboards and onto web pages. It says here, blocks of text included in a dashboard often can't be highlighted, searched, magnified, easily translated, or otherwise customized for readability. And parts of that are WCAG requirements. So one approach that has been taken is embedding a data dashboard on an HTML website, which helps you avoid this problem. And you can visit this example from the City of San Francisco COVID-19 data and reports. I was going to show you that example, but as we're running out of time, we'll save that. And if we have time in the question and answer period, we'll take a look. But you can follow the link and check it out yourself. Now, another point here that's we think is important. Data tables and accessibility. So this is so for assistive tech users, and particularly screen reader users, all users need to be able to interact with data at all levels, including at a granular level. And often the way that is possible for screen reader users is to have a data table enabled. It isn't the only way that this can work, but particularly with Power BI and Tableau, this is how you do it. And in Power BI, those data tables are enabled by default. In Tableau Public, you do have to enable that access. And another point here is that screen reader users often need to be informed of some of the commands that they'll need to use to access accessible features such as data tables. So for example, the Alt plus Shift plus F11 command, which opens data tables in Power BI, is not a widely known command by screen reader users. So it's often a good idea to have an accessibility notice where you let folks know that that's one of the commands they'll need to know. With that, I'll pass to Christine to make another point on accessible data and then to close us out.
Cool. Thanks, Adam. So I'm going to put this in the chat for you to explore, but I know with a lot of our data folks, we use color to convey meaning, and one element to be mindful of is the non-text contrast success criterion. And here we just provided 2 examples from this page. On the left, there is a pie chart that, I mean, maybe I'll ask you all. Do you think the pie chart on the left, thumbs up if it's good? Do we have a thumbs down? Are we allowed to be, oh, we're not allowed to be negative. Maybe give me the shock face emoji if it's not. There we go. And then on the right there. So talking about this, the goal for this non-text contrast, this is 1.4.11 double A. It's important. It states that important visual information meets the same minimum contrast required for larger text. In order to ensure this, visual cues need to achieve the 3.1 contrast against the background or against each other there, as in the pie chart, it's each pie slice, because some people can't access or see the elements that have low contrast. So on the left there, you were right with those emoji reactions. That one is technically a fail. The pie chart has labels, so that passes a little bit. But in order to understand the proportions of each pie slice, you need to be able to discern the edges of the slices, and the contrast between these slices is not high enough contrast. So especially those smaller ones, the yellow, the blue, and the green especially. So on the right side, this other pie giving the same information does pass because the pie chart has visible labels and it has sufficient contrast around and between the slices of the pie chart. So there's a darker border that has been added to the yellow slice in order to achieve that necessary contrast level. If you explore the link in the chat, you'll see many other examples of the ways in which a border can help us achieve that non-text contrast criterion. Sorry, we get really into this. Next slide. I promise we're almost done, but we're just nerd out a little bit. Next slide. So a little more on talking about the use of color. This is 1.4.1. So making sure that color is not the only way of distinguishing information that we are sharing. So the use, maybe you also include a shape or text to convey meaning in addition to color. So just some really not fancy examples here, using color to convey meaning. Often we see, red as bad, something missing, something is incomplete. So on the left side here, there's an example of a red box. We don't know what that means. Maybe it's someone's favorite color. Maybe it's a holiday expression. But on the next example shows both, right? We have red and we have an X to convey that something is missing from this field. This could be commonly used in like a form field or other elements of providing data. And then again, showing that something is complete. That green is not quite enough, but green with a checkbox would then convey enough. It would hit the criterion of this one. So yeah, I think we could go on and on about color, but I know we are creeping up on time. So if there's questions, we can explore a little bit more. And I think this is, okay.
That's a mistake.
And this is a prettier version of a slide we already touched on. Let's go to the next slide, please. Yes, helpful links. We've provided a lot of links in the chat. And I think, Michael, you have been keeping up amazingly. Thank you for that. Is there anything else we need to touch on this one, Adam?
No, I think we've said it all.
And I think we have one last one. So the questions that we posed at the beginning, who benefits from digital accessibility? I know we named certain folks, we named some disabilities, we named some assistive tech, but the secret is actually we all benefit from these accessibility principles and practices and applying them to our work. Who can uphold digital accessibility? I know we get into really specific criterion, and when I started doing this work, I was like, oh my goodness, what is this? What is WCAG? What am I doing? But guess what? We all have a role to play in upholding accessibility. especially digital accessibility. And I promise you can do it too. So just hoping to end on that higher note of we get into the weeds, but let's zoom out. There's a little something for everyone. And I hope you feel empowered to lean into this work, to learn a little bit more and to apply it to what you do. Thanks, everyone. We appreciate you spending this hour with us. If you need this document in another language, large print, Braille, or another format, please reach out to me, Christine Getman, christine.m.getman@oha.oregon.gov, or you can reach out by phone, voice, or text 971-610-2240. We appreciate you. So much love. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. We do have a couple of questions here that we can address in these last few minutes. Kind of getting back in the weeds, and from the Q&A, what is your approach to handling existing vendors under contract if they do not meet the standards? And then semi-related to exceptions, I guess. Somebody asked about old technical manuals prior to 2026. How those would interact with the exceptions there.
Well, with the few minutes remaining to us, okay, so the first question was, what do we do with vendors currently under contract? Can you read I'm trying to find that question.
Yeah, what is your approach to handling existing vendors under contract if they do not meet the standards? Presumably once the 2026 rule kicks in.
Well, I mean, so all right, I think our goal is to make sure that by the time that deadline kicks in, that we have reviewed our contracts and that we have strong language in place so that we can hold vendors accountable if they deliver content that does not meet the rules, and that we have a solicitation process in place, that where we are doing our due diligence to verify that vendors, when they make a claim, that they can provide accessible content, that they can actually do that, and that can, involve requesting a VPAT or an accessibility conformance report, ACR, as it's sometimes known, asking for previous work examples, asking vendors to complete a questionnaire about their accessibility practices. These are all things that are in place in other states. Minnesota does this, Texas does it, Maryland does it. We haven't done it as systematically, really, I think, as we need to do. So there's a process change and also, a change in the contracts that needs to happen. That's going to take time, and there are going to be ongoing contracts, that we may not be able to change right now, but we're going to have to, over time, review and update those contracts, I think. And we look forward to working closely with our contracting and procurement team here at OHA to make those changes, over time. I think that's the best I can answer.
Now, right?
Yeah.
That's why we're starting the conversation now, and planning out this more mindful implementation, getting us ready and prepared for that April 2026 deadline. I think some folks are like, oh, that's so far away, we don't need to go there. And I think you all are asking really great questions that are helping illustrate why we're starting this work now, why we're starting the conversations now, and why the policies are also already in effect. And that's to support getting us there in a way that's mindful and lets us take care of ourselves and our teams and our work.
Do we have time for that other question?
I think the last question we can wrap up on here is, what's the best way that people can keep updated with the work that you guys are doing?
Well, we're going to try and communicate as much as we can, I think, via that website. I mean, we'll be communicating internally, at OHA, and I believe ODHS will be doing the same through our respective newsletters. But we will try to also communicate as much as possible on that website that we shared. And of course, you can reach out to us. We do want to be we want to balance being, protecting our time, because we certainly have a lot of work ahead of us just at our agency, but we also do understand that this ultimately, this affects the state as a whole. Every agency at the state, whether it has a program or not, falls under these rules, and the actions that every agency takes will affect people with disabilities and everyone throughout the state, and that applies to counties and cities as well. So we want to, try and be as open, transparent, and sharing as we possibly can. So with that, if you have, if there's a question you have or something that you want to discuss, reach out to us. We may not be able to immediately get back to you, but we will try to be as responsive as we possibly can.
Absolutely. The last thing we want you to feel today is overwhelmed. So if you are feeling that way, we do want to hear from you. Like, let's talk through it. Let's get into it.
Awesome. Well, I am going to drop the SORA survey. We're having our end of year survey back in the chat here. Also, if you're not signed up for the listserv and you want to get emails from SORA, that link is also there. But we are at the hour, so I will say thank you once again. This was great. I think people very clearly got a lot out of it, judging by the very positive reactions in chat. So yeah, thank you guys both for presenting. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thanks all. Thanks, Michael.
All righty. Have a good lunch, everybody.